So my name is Stephen Eyre. I'm an assistant professor at Arizona State University, so I'm the third of the North American presenters, I guess, here today. And I should start by saying this topic is a bit different than the others in this session. So if you're here for primarily safety topics, this is a little bit out of that realm, so feel free if you'd like to check other presentations. That said, I would like to thank the organizing committee of LC3 for their flexibility in allowing us to present here so we can still showcase some of this work. So the paper I'm presenting is called Development of a Collaborative Process Mapping Activity to Improve Students' BIM Process Mapping Understanding. It's an educational study that we're presenting, and it was led by my graduate student, Aparna Parakamana. And she was doing our master's thesis on this topic, and the work was also supported by two others of my students, Michael Beauregard, a PhD student, and also Suleiman Al-Safori, a recent graduate PhD student of my team at ASU. So I guess I'd like to start with some kind of background, because I think it's always valuable to start with the motivation as to why we're studying what we're studying. So we talk about building information modeling a lot at a conference like this, and we see that in industry it's becoming increasingly common. And from an educator's perspective, someone who's in academia trying to prepare students with the skills for BIM, we're also seeing an increased demand for those students to have BIM knowledge. Right? And this is probably common, I suspect, in most of your universities, especially if you work closely with industry members. You're probably seeing some kind of demand, maybe related more to your areas of research. I don't know exactly, but my guess is you're probably seeing some kind of demand for students that can become new hires that have the skills to implement all these great ideas we talk about in a research context. So part of the challenge we have, or at least that I see as an educator of trying to teach BIM is not a super simple singular context. If we surveyed everyone and said, what does BIM mean to you, we'd probably get a lot of different terms and definitions of what that means. And to me, I think very simplistically, so I think of BIM as kind of from a teaching perspective, there's sort of two directions. There's BIM in terms of how do I use BIM? What buttons do I click on whatever software to generate a clash report or to generate cost information or a 4D schedule or whatever the BIM use case is we're looking at. That's sort of the using of BIM. And then there's also the planning for BIM. We talk so much in this conference, I've heard a bunch of presentations that talk about what we see in practice is not always the same as what we see in theoretical research in terms of potential value for technology. So do we teach the use of technology or planning for it so that we can actually manage it and maybe get some of those results that we talk about from a research context? And I tend to think is the answer that we should teach BIM management or the sort of what I call point and click side of BIM. And I think it's sort of a loaded question because I think the answer has to be both. I mean, at least at Arizona State University, our industry members we work with very closely, and they are constantly telling me, we want students that can use the software, that I can put them on a job tomorrow, and they are value added to our job. And that makes sense, but we've all seen how fast software evolves. If that's all we teach, that's a bit of a short-sighted way of educating students about BIM. So we also try to teach students about planning for BIM and defining use cases and defining value behind why they're using what they're using in terms of technology. This paper relates more to that second aspect of teaching management. So we've been using a guide that was developed originally by the Pennsylvania State University, which is my former institution. They developed a guide for planning for BIM execution planning or project execution planning, depending on how you prefer to term it. And we tend to use their guide to allow students to walk through a very defined process for defining an implementation plan for BIM. In this guide, they use something called business process mapping notation, which is just sort of a long way of saying a very structured way of defining process maps to illustrate an intended BIM process. So in a construction schedule, we might use Gantt charts showing line items for a construction schedule. Typically with BIM planning, or at least in this guide, and most of the guides I've seen, quite frankly, suggest using process mapping to illustrate BIM plans because you can illustrate iteration and communication a little bit easier through that mechanism. But we found this to be challenging. Students oftentimes struggle initially with getting this concept because they oftentimes haven't done process mapping before, right? They haven't done this in other classes. So I'll show an example here in case you've never seen. I'm going to sort of fade out the back because I don't actually want you to try to squint to read it. It doesn't matter. What does matter here, though, is this is an example process map that we might see for a project. This is the kind of thing that I have my students develop. And I have them do a semester-long project, and I say, here's the hypothetical building that you're going to be working on, and you are going to plan out and manage the BIM process for this project, and you owe me, as the owner in this project, you owe me different process maps to show me that you have a plan for implementing these different BIM uses. So that's what I asked for from the students. So the course that we explored for this study was a course called Project Management 1, which is their kind of not first exposure to BIM as Arizona State University students, but their first in-depth exposure to BIM, where they look at building information modeling and building information modeling planning. So sort of the point and click and the management that I talked about earlier. I give them a semester-long project. So we start at the very beginning of the semester. Some have varying levels of BIM expertise and experience, and I give them this project for BIM planning that they'll do throughout the semester. And to help with it, I mentioned that we had seen some challenges in the past, some potential opportunities for improvement, let's say, in some of the submissions that we got. So what we tried to do is develop an in-class activity to walk through this process of process mapping for BIM. So in some of the prior work that we had done, we gave students an activity in class, a 75-minute session, where we said, you're going to develop a process map for a given BIM use. It could be 3D coordination, it could be 4D scheduling, it could be energy analysis. There's lots of different BIM use cases that exist. We would pick one that the students had some level of familiarity with and say, you are to develop this process map. And in the past, we had them develop the process map individually. Then they would trade, so we'd give one person a process map that was blank, another that was a process map that was blank. Both would define a process map for the same BIM use, then they would switch halfway through the class, provide feedback to the others. So they would go through and say, I think you should have done this in this order, or this doesn't make sense. They'd trade back, reflect on the feedback they got, and see what changes they would make. The problem was we found out students felt very uncomfortable with this because even though they had some conceptual understanding of what they were trying to plan for, actually defining actionable steps on a process map was very challenging for them. So what we thought of doing this time was to say, well, why don't we group students together? So we'll still start off with students giving them an individual process map and say, you are to develop a process map for the same BIM use case. But now, I'm going to, after you do that individually, now I'm going to give you a new blank process map and group all three of, groups of students into groups of three, group all of them into the same group, and now collaboratively say, you three have to agree on a process map together for how you'll implement this BIM use. And so the thought was we could enable students to talk through some of those challenges that we had observed in the past, and also at a more just basic level, try to replicate an approach that hopefully is what's closer to what's being done in industry. I'm not saying industry members always collaborate about planning for BIM, but in a research context, we always highlight the need for collaboration and communication to implement BIM effectively. Well, let's simulate that here then and see if we can help with it. So we wanted to study the impact on collaboration on process mapping here, and the student's ability to use that notation I mentioned earlier, the process mapping language. So we also wanted to study from this the impact on the students' perception of their understanding. I had mentioned in the past we saw some confusion from students, so we wanted to study this here. So we took my course, used my class as one to study for this, had students in a 75-minute session, gave them pre- and post-activity questionnaires to assess their perception, and had them develop two different types of process maps. If you're not familiar with process maps here on this, think of level 1 as a macro level. It's a project level, so you might list all of your different BIM uses for that project. And think of level 2 as use by use, or individual use case process maps. And we used, for a level 2 map, these are the ones we've been talking about, these use specific, we used the BIM use case of 3D coordination, or some might call it clash detection, or mechanical, electrical, plumbing coordination. The idea of putting all of our systems together and seeing where potential issues arise. We started having students develop it individually, develop then one in a group of 3, as I mentioned before. And the other thing we did that we wanted to try to explore in this, because it was a collaborative setting, we color-coded the responses. What I mean by that is we had 3 different colored pens that we gave out. So we had, I think it was a blue, a black, and a red. So we would give a different colored pen to or at least distribute them equally among the students in the class and and say when they group up into groups of 3, you need to have a member with a different colored pen. So you need one red, one black, and one blue. The reason for this was so that later, when we developed process maps, we could see, for instance, here's a sample of one that someone with a black pen developed, and they went through and they created a process map, and we could study attributes of this, things like, did they use BPMN notation correctly in it? Which in this one, sort of, right? There's some things they kind of took some creative liberties on, but sort of. And then what we could also study is when they did a collaborative map, who contributed in what way to the development of this process map. We were especially interested to see, does one person sort of commandeer the whole activity and say, I'm just going to write it and I'm going to do this thing, or do they collaborate? And the answer, by the way, to that is both. We saw some instances with only one color. This doesn't automatically mean that there wasn't collaboration, but it certainly doesn't indicate directly that there was formalized collaboration in terms of actually writing the process map. And then we saw others like this that did have these kind of multicolored approaches that we could study. And so what we found is, I guess at a general level here, is students were successful at creating the process maps for the given uses. They were able to submit something that addressed the needs of the problem, but they still had some challenges. They had challenges with the use of business process mapping notation. This was still the first time most of them had seen it. Some may have seen it in other courses, but it wasn't necessarily a formalized activity in other prior courses that they may have taken. And the other thing we saw that was probably more concerning for where we go in future work is we saw some challenges in terms of having realistic orders of BIM operations. What I mean by that is in some of them that were sort of the level 1, the macro level, project level BIM uses, we would see people go through a project, and if you're familiar with 4D modeling, so think of that as kind of your construction site 3D model with the 4th dimension of time showing a schedule. We would see some students go through, do all of their 3D modeling early on, build the project, and after it was done, they said, only now can we make a 4D model to illustrate what we've done. Typically, at least on projects in the state, having a 4D model after the fact is not really all that effective. So we saw some concerning elements here, and I'll talk just a moment, my last couple minutes here, about the next steps, because I think this is sort of an incremental study to, I hope, a more exciting research activity that we'll do in the future. So first, a couple things to mention of where we're headed. One, we need a simpler approach. What we did, we still found was very complex and confusing for a lot of the students. So what we're planning to do in the future is separate the activities of learning BIM process mapping language, so that's BPMN, and then the other of just learning those basic concepts, order of operations. 4D should probably occur before you actually build so people know what they're expected to do. And so what we're doing in this simplified activity here is we've developed one initially. We haven't published anything yet. We're still sort of refining it. But the idea we've done is we actually task students with a similar process mapping activity from a methodological standpoint. But we say, forget about BIM. Forget about construction even. Let's take something that is super simple. And so we have them process map eating a meal at a sit-down restaurant, which sounds sort of silly on the surface. But if you think about it from a process map standpoint, we all understand the process of eating a meal at a restaurant. We know there are certain activities that must occur. We know there's different stakeholders, say a customer, a waiter, and a chef. We know that different information must be exchanged between those individuals. Certain individuals, the chef, maybe needs to reference external information, like a recipe, or something like that. Or maybe the customer needs to reference other information like dietary restrictions, whatever. The idea is to say, in this simplified activity, can we remove the constraint of having a complex process like BIM that may be foreign to students, and say, let's just focus on the idea of business process mapping notation, just the language of process mapping, and after we get that, then we'll do a BIM process. The other thing we want to do in the future is find a standardized method for assessment. So I talked a little here about assessment, but right now this is kind of a limitation of what we've done. We've looked at perception, and that is nice as a research standpoint. It's easy to measure. We can study perception, Likert scale questions. How much do you think this helped you? But there is a very fundamental limitation. Is it accurate? If you think something was good for your education, was it? And how do we know that? So what we're looking to do in the future is develop a rubric. Now, for some things that are very structured, developing a rubric can be rather simple. For For something like a process map, there can be some real challenges with this because there are arguably infinite right answers to the challenge of solving a process map. So we're in the process right now of we have a rubric developed. We're in the process of validating the rubric to see if we can indeed assess it. And the reason we think this matters beyond just a classroom context is I think in the broader scale of things, when we talk companies and industry not always realizing the full benefits of BIM, if we could use something like this to actually help them assess their process maps on actual projects, maybe we can start to enable better planning and maybe starting to see in reality some of the gains that we've claimed to see in the research realm. So with that, I'd like to thank you all for being here, and if there's questions, I'd be happy to answer.